So good afternoon. I'm Bill Kennedy, GIC's Vice Chair of Programs and your host for today. On behalf of the Global Interdependence Center's Board of Directors, welcome to today's executive briefing. As a reminder to our guests, this event is being recorded and the replay will be available through the GIC website later today. We will have time for audience Q&A towards the end. You can enter your question by selecting Q&A icon, type in your question, and you can enter your question at any time during today's presentation. If we're unable to get to your question, the GIC staff will strive to follow up after today's program. We're in for a real treat today as we explore central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, crypto, and blockchain with our two featured guests. Jim Bianco is president and macro strategist at Bianco Research, where for nearly 20 years, his wide-ranging commentaries have addressed monetary policy, the intersection of markets and politics, the role of government in the economy, fund flows, and positioning in the financial markets, including cryptocurrencies. Jim built a decades-long reputation for objective, incisive commentary that challenges consensus thinking, and he regularly appears in the financial press. Prior to Bianco Research, Jim held senior roles at UBS Securities, First Boston, Shearson Lehman Brothers, and he's a chartered market technician and a member of the Market Technicians Association. Jim earned his bachelor's degree in finance from Marquette University and an MBA from Fordham University. Dave Nadig is Chief Investment Officer and Director of Research at ETF Trends and ETF Database, and the respective blogs ETFtrends.com and ETFDB.com. Dave previously served as the CEO and CIO of ETF.com Analytics before it was acquired by FactSet. Dave researched and analyzed and reported on the investment management industry for more than 25 years. He was a managing director at Barclays Global Investor, where he helped design and market some of the first ETFs. And he was the co-founder of metamarkets.com and Cerulli Associates. Like Jim, Dave is widely quoted in the financial press, and he recently co-authored a book for the CFA Institute titled A Comprehensive Guide to Exchange Traded Funds. Dave earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and an MBA from Boston University. Jim and Dave, welcome to the executive briefing.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick audience survey. And so we're going to put a survey up on screen. And the question we would like to know is, do you have any financial exposure to cryptocurrency? And while they're answering, Jim, I know that you are yes. And Dave, where do you land on the spectrum?
I do. I have some direct cryptocurrency holdings, which is primarily so that I have something to play with, because you can't actually use any of this ecosystem if you don't have some lying around. But I don't have a substantial portfolio allocation now. Okay,
fantastic. So just looking at our provisional results here, still a few coming in. It looks like we're just about 30-70. So 30% have said yes, 70% have no. Gentlemen, your work is cut out for you. Let's see if
we can get that up, but we'll get that higher before the end of the presentation here.
There you go. There you go. So let's start off the conversation just talking about central bank digital currencies. So at last count, I think there was about 60% of global central banks have experimented with some sort of CBDC, a digital form of the country's fiat currency that's regulated by the central bank. I think the Bahamas were first in line. The Bahamas launched the world's first CBDC with the sand dollar. And after about 5 years of research by the PBOC, China launched the digital yuan in April of 2020. It seems like the US Federal Reserve is not among the 60% of central banks that are moving forward. So before we talk about the Fed's role in central bank digital currencies, Jim, can you just explain what is a CBDC?
It's a digital version of your currency. Ideally, it could come in many different sizes and flavors, but ideally what it would be is it would be an electronic version, the central bank would offer you an electronic wallet, an app on your phone, and you would transact with that currency by transferring it between your app and a vendor or another person as well too. Interest rates could be paid on it directly into your account. Central bank would have the ability to change those interest rates, and depending on how they construct it, maybe have some ability to audit your transactions, what you've done with your money or what you haven't done with your money. Again, that depends on how deep they want to go in something like that.
Yeah, and maybe just a couple nuanced pieces around that. So the things being proposed and rolled out across the world, they're all wildly different, and they tend to get rolled up underneath this sort of moniker of CBDC, right? Because it rolls off the tongue really easily. I think it gets conflated with blockchain all the time. Some of these implementations are using blockchain type technologies for their ledgers. Some of them aren't. Some of them are just entirely centralized new transfer systems. There really isn't a standard here yet. There's no, this is how it should be done. Probably the most interesting stuff has been done around from the Bank of International Settlement. They've had a really strong group of researchers continuing to do work here and keep resurfacing what other folks are doing. But at this point, there's 7 to 10 different models of how you might work this, from a completely decentralized system, which just sort of looks like state-sanctioned Bitcoin more than anything else, to something that honestly just looks like relabeling the automated clearinghouse system we're already using in the United States, right? And you know, a couple tweaks on the end in a smartphone app, and you can call that your CBDC, and you wouldn't really have done much. So there's a lot of gap in between. I think the key point that Jim's bringing up is that ability for the central bank to use policy through a CBDC is why I think this is interesting. I think the rest of it's mostly noise.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
I just was going to add one other thing too, that Dave's right. There's a bunch of different flavors and a bunch of different ways you can go with this. And I think central banks need to ask the basic question of what problem are they trying to solve with a CBDC? And it seems like the problem that they're trying to solve, at least initially, is, oh, China's got one and we need to have one too. And that's about as far as they've thought this through, because a lot of these CBDCs, depending on what you do with them, could disintermediate your current financial system or not. And you know, they could disintermediate your payment system or not. And so really, you have to identify what is the issue that we're trying to solve, and how does a CBDC go about doing it. And again, to repeat myself, it seems like the issue is China has one, so we need to really look really hard at one too.
So Jim,
sorry, go ahead.
Could the problem possibly be the problem they're trying to solve is the U.S. not losing its reserve currency status? Is that a possibility?
That is a possibility. That is something that they're looking at. And I guess the real question you'd have to ask yourself is, why does the U.S. have reserve currency status? And I would argue that it is the size of the economy, the rule of law, and some of the legacies that it has, in addition to some other things too. It is not that a digital yuan is going to automatically make it attractive relative to the dollar. If they were a serious competitor to the reserve currency of the United States, they'd be right now, even without a digital version. Same thing with the euro, same thing with the yen or the pound or whatever other currency you might think would have happen. Now that I've said that, it is possible in a scenario that I could see into the future, just a scenario where a cryptocurrency, a decentralized cryptocurrency, could maybe supplant or make a run at being the reserve currency. We don't have one now. They're working on some interesting possibilities that might in the future if they pan out, but that's might in the future if they pan out.
Yeah, I actually think the issue of sort of the US dollar status of reserve currency sort of has to live separate from the issue of sort of crypto and central bank digital currencies in general. Like, if you think about why China is first here in some ways and what they're doing with it, they're not doing it because they want every transaction in the world to go through the yuan. They're not doing it because they want every American to have, 500 renminbi sitting in a wallet somewhere, and that somehow balloons the amount of held currency, and that's what gives them reserve currency status. I think that's a little bit misguided. If they'd wanted, like to Jim's point, if they'd wanted to do that, they could have done that quite easily a long time ago. I think this is much more about getting control over the shadow banking system in China and really starting to be able to exert the kind of force they want to. And if we have any question what kind of force they're trying to exert, today's headlines where they were just quietly suggesting that the CEO of Evergrande pay off the debts with his own personal money, like that sounds fun. I mean, we're all smiling and chuckling about that a little bit. Fully digitizing the currency system would allow them to simply make it so, Jean-Luc Picard style, right? It becomes a tool of an authoritarian state like we've never seen before. I think that's a much more plausible explanation for what's going on in China than any end run they're trying to make towards reserve currency status.
So if I could just real quick, just make a follow up on China. They have been test marketing a digital yuan. By all indications, it's gotten a very tepid, lukewarm response. Most of the consumers in China have said WeChat Pay, Alipay, the alternatives that are put out by the big fintech companies have been a better option. And in typical China response is, okay, well then we'll just regulate WeChat Pay and Alipay and make them worse so that we make our digital currency relatively look better. Point is that they're even finding that just because you roll out a digital currency doesn't mean that everybody's going to flock to start using it. And that's what they've learned in China.
Yeah, and if you look at the actual development work being done, most of the stuff that you're seeing come out, whether it's papers in Canada or any of the 47 speeches we've given here in the US, nobody's actually addressing any of those interesting questions around things like use cases, right? There's a reason that retail corporations have come to dominate the transaction space. It's because they're better at it. They're responding to customer demands. They're solving those day-to-day problems of privacy versus security versus uptime in market responsive ways, which is frankly how you should do it. There will be no one CBDC answer that both works for me sending Jim $100 to settle a bar bet and also works for me wiring $1 million overseas to a company, right? They're different entire streams of economic activity that don't need to run on the same rails.
So what about the US Fed? Are they even thinking about CBDC, or they've been relatively quiet? And I've heard two arguments. The first argument is we are way behind. There is no plan. We're losing power in the process. And the other is, look, they're going to leave it to the markets, and we're not going to be a hyper controlled, centralized approach by the U.S. regulators. Where do the two of you come on that spectrum? What do you think is happening with the Fed with regard to a digital currency?
So let me start, and I'll start with a little bit of a history. You go back to last winter, early spring. Jay Powell was very clear. We don't have to be first. We have to be right. We'll take as long as we need to. Then in April, they did an about face. We'll have a position paper out this summer, a position paper just laying out the issues about how they're thinking about it, CBDC, not what the crypto space calls a white paper, which is the schematic of how it's going to work. That would come later. That was supposed to be out this summer. Then this summer became September. Then September became October. October became soon. And my point is that I think they're running into problems. I think they were going to write a paper about it. And as we said, there's 18 different ways they could go with this. Every one of these has a big policy issue. What problem are you trying to solve? And I don't think they're quite there yet in terms of where they want to go. Now, I do think that they believe they need to be in the game of producing a central bank digital currency. They're not going to wait for somebody else to do it. They're not going to wait for the marketplace to do it. It probably represents a threat to the banking system and or a threat to the Federal Reserve if they allow somebody to disintermediate them without at least trying to play in that sandbox.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it would be a stretch to say they've done no work, right? We've seen some good stuff come out of the Dallas Fed. There have been some papers that got published. There are clearly some very smart people thinking about this, not just at the Fed, but other places. I mean, DTC has published some really interesting stuff around blockchain settlement. Like, there's a lot of really smart people in government doing really interesting work. The problem is to actually get anything useful done would require actual legislation. You can't just do all this by rulemaking, and there's just no capacity or desire to do actual legislating in DC right now, which is why I think this is really years off in the US, and we will get lapped. I think it's almost inevitable.
Okay. Let's turn to cryptocurrencies, if we may. So since the creation of Bitcoin, which was in 2009, I think there have been something like 11,000 cryptocurrencies that have been established and brought to market. Jim, you highlighted that the current market size is $2.5 trillion. Just by comparison, that's I think the U.S. muni market's probably $4 trillion, right? So it's grown, and it's grown exponentially in the last couple of years. So with that context, Dave, maybe you can share, terminology, if we can get a definition. Sure. We hear a lot about altcoins. What is an altcoin?
Well, it's anything that's not Bitcoin. It's the short and easy answer. I think the more useful way of thinking about it is, of the things that we refer to as cryptocurrencies, what are their use cases? And I think that's where it gets interesting. So Bitcoin is a class of cryptocurrency, which is fundamentally just a store of value asset. And I don't want to get into a lot of arguments about what it can or can't be, but fundamentally the idea is to move value from point A to point B, and with all the features that we've come to associate with blockchain. And that has some use, right? That's why people call it things like digital gold and all that kind of stuff. Most of the rest of the ecosystem are what I would call utility coins or security coins, right? They have some other function than simply existing to be a psychological asset traded back and forth between you and me. So when we talk about things like Ethereum and Ether, right, that's a utility coin, right? There is a network that does real work. In order for that real work to be done, you need Ether to burn into the system. And it is also the way you move value around the system at the same time. That's where stuff starts getting really interesting. And I would say most of the non-Bitcoin coins we're talking about fall broadly into that category of utilities, where there is some other work that is supposed to be done in the system. That's where stuff gets interesting. Jim, would you have a different definition there?
No, I think that's a very good definition. The only other thing I would add to that is, why are there 11,000 of them? and yes, most of them will probably go to zero eventually over time. What it is, harken back to the free banking era of the 19th century. This is private property money, is what it is. All of these currencies or tokens, because they do differentiate between Bitcoin and Ethereum and stuff being currencies and the rest of them being tokens, are designed to align incentives. And they're designed to reward people for doing certain things or punish people by taking it away if they do bad activities. It's referred to as slashing in this space as well, too. So the reason that there are so many of them is they are starting to think of money as not necessarily being a public good issued by some central authority, either a central bank or a government, but that money is a private property that can be created and literally on the blockchain in the crypto space. Dave, I, or you could bet, if we knew how to do it, could probably spin up a coin in about an hour. Just basically write some coin and just create one out of thin air. Now, to get people to trade it and assign value to it, that's the trick. But to make them, it's not very hard at all.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most exciting things about this whole space is how utterly easy it is. I mean, I have a laptop over here and a desktop over there whose only job is to be crypto nodes. That's all I do on them. And to Jim's point, like, you can go pull down the code base and spin up your own fork of Bitcoin, I would say, in about 15 minutes. It's not actually quite difficult. And then you can set up another node on a different laptop that's mining it for you, and you can run transactions back and forth across your home network. That's literally the exact same technology being used right now on billion-dollar Bitcoin transactions. And you can spin it up and alter it and mess with the code yourself. When you get over to the sort of the DeFi part of the world, the sort of utility part of the world, it's even crazier, the amount of stuff that you can do locally just to explore it. And I think that's part of what gets people so excited about it, is it really does feel like the reinvention of computer programming in some ways, right? It's computer programming with teeth. And there's a lot of really exciting stuff that can happen with that. And there's a lot of really awful stuff that can happen with that. And so I think all the discussion around regulation of crypto and CBDCs is largely trying to balance those two things out. Where are the public goods and where are the problems?
So that really helps explain, Jim, how we got to 11,000. What's the differentiation of the winners and the losers? What's going to decide of the 11,000? These are the 10 that matter, or the 5 that matter, or the 20, whatever the number is. How do you view that, Jim?
The tokenomics, that's the phrase they use for the economics behind the coin. You create a coin, you are trying to create something that represents value for a network or value for a community. And people will value that community, and then that coin will be a way that you can gain access to the community, that you can trade information on the community, or that maybe you can use as a currency to get something else from the community as well too. If you've got your incentives aligned, and there are some really good ones with tokenomics, some of the interoperability tokens. Interoperability means there's a lot of blockchains, and there are some tokens like the chain links in the chart in the graph are 3 examples where you can actually use their protocol to transfer one coin from one blockchain to another coin for another blockchain. To do that, you have to pay them with their coin. So they created a coin. You have to go out into a decentralized market, acquire that coin, use that coin to pay. That's one of many different examples. So they're not asking for dollars. They're not asking for yuan. They're assigning their value by you using their own coin in order, or token in this case, in order to affect transactions. If you get that tokenomics correct, then they can be very powerful. If you wind up with the tokenomics as being ill thought, or maybe just a pure meme coin, Doge being the example of it, which everybody or most people, serious people in the crypto space hate, it has no value. It only has, its only value is that people pump it all the time on social media and they play a wild speculative game. Ultimately, most people, me included, think that that's destined to be worth 0 at some point in the future. And the sooner it happens, the better, I think.
But Jim, I think your example is a really good one of, like, the simplest utility in the crypto space is swapping one crypto from another crypto. And a lot of the early protocols here, Uniswap, SushiSwap, et cetera, were really about providing these really fundamental fungibility services where you could take Bitcoin on this blockchain and move it and wrap it and put it on another blockchain. I think that's really important, because I think old guys like me who are, wading into this space get hung up on the idea of like useful work and where's the real value and things like that. Like, that's real work. I can identify that. I can say this is a value being added to a system. Therefore, I'm going to pay for it, and I'm being asked to pay for it in company script. So I have to go get company script in order to pay it, or I have to earn company script doing some other activity. That's really the fundamentals of what's going on here. That's where all the interesting technology is. And then there's the question of, so what? Like, what are the implications for, buying a cheeseburger and like real world economics? And that's where I think, a lot of the jury's still out.
I would agree with that. I've heard this space being described as, in the 12 years since Bitcoin was first traded, that we've gone from the Stone Age of writing numbers on seashells to the Middle Ages, that this new financial system has progressed that far in just 12 years. It's still in the Middle Ages. It's still not in the modern era, although it is a modern technology. But to get to the point where Dave was talking about, when am I going to use it to buy a cheeseburger? When am I going to use it to pay my employees or something like that? We're not there yet. But if you understand the space, you could see various roads that we're heading down, that in the future we can be there.
So that leads to the point of, will we see crypto become true currencies, a medium of exchange, a store of value?
Yeah,
will it ever replace cash, and will it ever replace gold?
I think it's already doing it more than people realize. It's just happening in rarefied circles. if you have, a MetaMask wallet just sitting on your desk, right? Very commonly used, particularly by like Gen Xers like me, right? MetaMask is the wallet of Gen X. So if you have a couple of Ethereum sitting there, it's actually shocking how much you can do with it in terms of buying goods and services, in terms of playing a game, buying content, renting a movie. Like there's a surprising amount of commerce that can be done directly through the blockchain. The challenge is all of those things are still generally valued in some species currency somewhere, right? Nobody is selling you a book for 0.03 Ether and letting that be 0.03 Ether for 20 years. They're going to change it based on every tick of how much that's worth in a dollar or a euro or a yen, depending on where you're living. So that's really the challenge, is this disconnect between the value and the rails of the system itself. The rails are working and they're really cool and really fun stuff's being done with them. And they're really being used much more than people think they are. The problem is everything's still pegged back to the dollar. And that's an economics issue, not a technology issue.
Just to add to that, there is this species that everybody's talking about is stable coins. And there's about 130 odd billion dollars worth of stable coins, at least market value outstanding, up from 18 months ago, about $1 or $2 billion. That's how fast that has grown. If you dig down into the stable coin data, what you'll find is that on average, about 10 to $20 billion a day of stable coins transfer from wallet to wallet. Now, what that means is in some places, and the example that I've used that I've heard about is a Vietnamese supplier, a Vietnamese manufacturer uses an Indonesian supplier, and at the end of the month, they owe them $50 million. Well, I can go to my Vietnamese bank and they'll charge me a fee, and then they'll exchange it into the Indonesian rupee and they'll charge me a fee, and then they'll transfer it and they'll charge me a fee, and it's a taxable event. And then the Vietnamese bank will be charged a fee, or the Indonesian bank will be charged a fee as well too. Or you can open a MetaMask wallet, I'll open a MetaMask wallet, and I'll send you $50 million of the stable coin in 30 seconds, and we're done with the deal. That is happening. It's not happening at levels that would be rounding errors near zero, but it is happening more and more, and people are starting to get more and more attuned to those kind of ideas. So yes, it is coming. It's just not there yet.
And I think that's the thing that regulators are really most concerned about. Because like, if you're an international regulator, if you're like work at Interpol and somebody just explains what Jim just explained, you break out in a cold sweat, right? Because all of a sudden you're saying, wait a minute, I can have hundreds of millions of dollars of transactions settling in dollars in seconds between anonymous parties, and I have no idea what's going on. Like, that is problematic if your job is to be a cop of some sort. And that's a lot of what we're seeing getting wrestled with by regulators right now, is how do you bring some of that stuff back under the umbrella of the rule of law? And that's part, to Jim's point, again, that's part of the reason why all this stuff does end up running back through dollars generally, is at the end of the day, you still kind of want to count on somebody with an army and taxing authority behind all this.
So to that point, Dave, there seems to be, back to this centralization, central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies can either be hyper centralized or hyper decentralized. Mm-hmm. And where do you think we'll wind up as a world, as a society, as a globally interdependent gathering of people? Do you think that this technology and this advancement is going to be more hyper control by governments, or it's going to go the other direction?
I think it's going to be 45-mile-an-hour speed limits on the Autobahn, right? I think that they're going to try to slap regulation around the edges of the system based on where people happen to live and pay their taxes. And it's going to be almost universally ignored and unenforceable. That's my actual prediction. Like, it will probably be illegal or heavily regulated for me to go send Jim 15 grand in stable coins or ETH or anything else in a year or two, and we'll still do it because there'll be no way for them to track it. I think there's a ridiculous Pollyanna belief system amongst the regulators that I've talked to that this is a genie that can be effectively put back in the bottle. Right. And yeah, they've tried to do that with, I don't know whether you're familiar with the idea of transaction commingling as way of like dealing with money laundering. Bitcoin mixers, as they often get called, like they're illegal in almost every major regulated jurisdiction. They still exist and have billions of dollars flowing through them every day, despite the fact every place you would think anybody having $1 billion would lie around wouldn't be able to use it, because how can they possibly track it, right? I mean, we've reached a level where the cryptography and the security by obscurity that you can get just algorithmically by hopping a transaction 1 million times before you get to an end wallet, it's ridiculous to think they're going to be able to do it. So I think we're going to be over-regulated and largely ignored.
That's
Jim?
what you're seeing in China right now. The big news of the last month was China kicked out the miners. China banned Bitcoin, and the joke in the space was again. And there was almost no reaction in the marketplace other than the cryptocurrencies jiggled for a couple hours and then kind of ignored it after that, because at the end of the day, they really can't do anything. It is a decentralized, pseudo-anonymous, meaning that my account has a 64-digit letter number code, but you don't know it's me unless I decide publicly to make that known as well too. And there's no way you can really turn that off, or there's no way you can really block it. And another thing, Chain Analysis is a company that does a lot of work in the crypto space. And they've looked at the penetration of cryptocurrencies among countries, the percentage of your population or your GDP. And only one country in the top 20 is a developed country. That's the United States at number 9. I believe that Vietnam or the Philippines is number 1. Nigeria is in the top 5, even though they've banned it. They're still in the top 5 as well, too. So now that you start thinking about, okay, we're going to put the genie back in the bottle. Oh, and by the way, it is a big thing in the Philippines. It is a big thing in Africa. It is a big thing in Asia. It is a big thing in the Middle East. So how are you going to put that back in the bottle? There's also been a statement put out that we've recently passed something like 200 million online wallets worldwide. There's been no technology in history that has gotten that level of adoption, either a percentage of the population or a gross number, that's ever been put back into a bottle. That it's almost reached its breakout. Now it could break out and flame out and be a bad technology, but to think that, oh, we're going to tell 200 million people around the world, most of which that are in third world countries with little regulation, we're going to snap our fingers and shut this whole thing down. That ship sailed long ago. That's not possible.
And I think even if that was going to happen, like even if the US said, we're going to ban cryptocurrencies for US citizens starting December 1st, right? First of all, they never are very good at figuring out how to do those things retroactively because time exists. So they're going to broadcast that ahead of time. All you'll do is create a rush for people to offshore assets, offshore with air quotes around it, into this unregulated crypto environment that has now been banned in the US. And then a whole new ecosystem will develop around moving that money around and getting it to do useful work and bridging that into goods and services that people want. So you'll end up buying plane tickets through a Uruguayan, front in order for them to be delivered to your email address so that you can go for a trip with a ticket you paid for in Bitcoin. Like these things already exist. They already happen. So the idea that somehow another ban would even move the needle, it seems ridiculous. Now, I suppose the opposite is true, which is if, the US came out and said, hey, no regulation whatsoever, everybody do what you want. I guess that would be really bullish, but on the other hand, I also think it would probably scare off a lot of the institutional players, right? Appropriate regulation is, I think, what most people want.
Yeah, one other real quick thing. We've been talking about the downside of all this. Let me give you an example of the upside. And it may not sound like an example first, but you got to look through it. So in that chain analysis, the last update they did in September, the country that came in at number 20 was Afghanistan. Now, it's not the government of Afghanistan funding terrorism. What it is that once the country fell apart and the Taliban took over, there's 19 million people in that country. The baker had to wake up that day. He's still going to make his bread. He needs to get paid. The cobbler needs to fix shoes. He needs to get paid and buy some bread. Their monetary system effectively collapsed. They started using Bitcoin. They started using Bitcoin out of necessity rather than being dictated to like they did in El Salvador. It's not big. It's mainly still an underground dollar economy in Afghanistan, but it's gaining traction all the time. So there are some positive use cases, especially in poorer countries and in trying areas like Afghanistan, that, look, I still got to get paid to make this bread, and you got to pay me. And what are you going to pay me in if you don't have dollar bills? We're going to start using, and we all have, because one of the things that's constant about the world right now is everybody's got one of these, my smartphone.
Yeah.
And everybody, even in Afghanistan, has an LTE connection on it, and we can download an electronic wallet and start using that. And so we're starting to see that kind of adoption coming as well, too. So it's not all bad. It's not all about nefarious activities. There are some positive things going on there, too.
Yeah. And the big counter argument to Jim's point is often well, but if you're in a dictatorial country and it's a war zone, you're really counting on the internet being up. Turns out the answer is actually yes. Like, it turns out most of the third world skipped most of the infrastructure we built after World War II and went straight to cell tower based internet. And sure, you can bomb those things and all of that. But, the average person is still not that far a drive from some connection to the internet that would allow them to get a transaction through. I think it's actually one of the most robust parts of our global infrastructure is actually the internet. Funny enough, we designed it that way, right? It was designed as a defense protocol in the beginning. Turns out it actually pretty much works. So to Jim's point, yeah, for folks that are in a situation where central bank managed currency is not really a viable option for economic activity, it just works.
I want to emphasize that point that Dave made. It's really important for Americans to understand this, that if you look at download speeds, upload speeds, and internet, mobile phone penetration, the U.S. ranks somewhere near the middle of the world right now. Yeah. If you're in New York City and you're working on your cell phone, downloading something off of Netflix or uploading something, or if you're in a war zone in the Middle East, the war zone in the Middle East might actually have better connection than New York City. Why is that? Because the U.S., as Dave said, we have 100% copper lines in every building in this country. So when mobile phones and cellular technology came, we all said, what do we need it for? I already got a phone in every room of every building in this country. We don't need it. They didn't, and they've really embraced it. Their whole economies are built around that. And yeah, you could blow up a couple of towers, but they could put up another tower in a day or two, or you could drive a little bit and get another connection from another tower. And that happens all the time in the third world. So they're not afraid of using that mobile technology for commerce.
Dave, let me ask you, as the definitive ETF expert, certainly in this country, I think you've got a pretty interesting perch to comment about all of the ETF action in the crypto space, really in the last couple of weeks. Can you just explain to the audience what's been taking place in the markets, a lot of new ETFs coming out, and how's that going to change things for this space?
So, the big news is obviously the launch of the crypto futures, or the Bitcoin futures based ETFs, sort of the USO for Bitcoin, if you will. It's probably like the worst best solution we have at the moment, largely because of what we've been talking about, I think this risk of misregulation, the fact that these ecosystems are going to evolve, whether the US pays attention to it or not, makes me believe that the bridge cases are really important, meaning having ways to move money from the regulated side of the economy, stocks, bonds, cash, to the what will be or misregulated part of the economy, which will be crypto. That becomes incredibly important. And I'm glad that we're starting to build those bridges. The futures market bridge was the worst way we could have done it. Like an actual just straight up GLD for Bitcoin would have been much more sensible and actually probably would work better. Clearly there's demand. We're about $2 billion already flowed into these things in a week. So clearly there's a lot of demand, but it doesn't fulfill that full purpose of being this beautiful, hedgeable, creatable, redeemable asset like a Bitcoin or an ETH ETF would. Whether we get one of those, I don't think we're going to until the SEC decides what it wants to do and it grows up about regulation here. And all signs point to meh. Like, I don't get any sense that we're going to get any real progress here until we deal with the stablecoin issue, until we deal with the AML KYC issues, until there's sort of an official regulatory policy on that. It's kicked way down the road. So what we got right now is a handful of these futures-based products. They'll largely serve the same role of being sort of a marginable, lendable, shortable asset on the security side of the balance sheet, which provides you a peg to the crypto side of the balance sheet. it'll be sloppy, and a lot of money is going to go into the hands of market makers and capitalists as opposed to the people doing the real work, because we put it together in this futures contract method, but it'll still get the job done.
Good. So Jim, let's turn to blockchain, the technology itself. And how do you see blockchain transforming not just capital markets, but other business applications away from capital markets?
So there's a term that's being thrown around that's called Web 3.0. We currently work on what's called Web 2.0. Web 2.0 are the platform companies, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Netflix, and so there's a centralized exchange, there's a centralized company, Twitter being a Web 2.0 company as well. Web 3.0 is moving back peer-to-peer transaction. So if I send a tweet or I send an email, I'm not going through a centralized server that then distributes it. That centralized server charges me money, and it maybe permissions me, and it maybe censors me as well too. The whole cancel culture that we start talking about. In Web 3.0, I will have my own identity on the internet. It will be immutable. It won't be changeable. I can then use that identity to reach out to somebody else directly without going through any kind of a network or any kind of a platform. That's why they call them protocols. In other words, the entire internet will be run on the blockchain. I will register my device as me. And when that device comes in to a website like my bank will see that this address is coming, and on the internet, it is immutable. They know that that address can't be hacked, can't be spoofed. And it'll say, oh, that's Jim, and he has an account. Let him see his account. No passwords. It'll get rid of all the passwords in our world. Well, we'll have one password left, super safe password that you'll have, which is called private keys.
I'll forget that one too.
Yes. Don't forget it, because one of the problems that you have on the internet, one of the problems you have in the block space place is it's called your private key. If you lose your private key, it is gone. That's one. And by the way, I might parenthetically add to Dave, my understanding is that's one of the problems that this SEC is having about a spot cryptocurrency ETF is about custody.
Key storage.
Yeah, exactly. Because all of these coins would be stored in an electronic wallet. And if somebody loses that password, they're just gone. It's just gone. There's the famous story about the guy that's got $800 million of Bitcoin locked in a wallet. He's tried 9 times. He's got one more attempt to try and remember what his password is to unlock it. And it's not hackable as well. So what it's going to do is it's going to change the entire economics of the internet. Right now, I'm on social media. Dave's on social media. We talk to each other on social media. And we both work very hard to make Twitter rich. We both work very hard to attract followers and users. And Twitter then, maybe in some instances might, or YouTube might throw some advertising dollars our way if we register for it. In this new world, I am 100% in control of my data, of my content, of my intellectual property. I decide if I want to advertise, and I decide how much I want to get. They don't permission me. So that's really the big thing that the blockchain can very well do. So the argument is the entire internet will be run on the blockchain in the future. And I might add, cryptocurrencies are an integral part of that, because it gets back to our whole, aligning incentives type of thing, that when I've established my own community, I can establish my own cryptocurrency to use as script in order to affect things, either pay people or get paid, or require them in order to have access to my community, or something along those lines as well too. So yes, the blockchain can be the internet. It can be as important as the internet as we quickly move to these Web3 applications.
So
Dave, anything to add?
Yeah, let me throw a little bit of, so that was a great articulation of what I would call the bull case, right, for Web 3.0 and what blockchain enables. There's some enormous caveats to it, which the biggest one of which is the fail state. right? The problem with most of crypto is what Matt Levine of Bloomberg calls the high stakes game of password remembering that all of crypto is based on. And it is a legitimate issue, not just because the SEC won't approve a Bitcoin ETF because of that. They could get over that, right? Cold storage exists. The reason it's a problem is because what the SEC and the Fed are actually, at the end of the day, worried about is voters losing access to all of their assets. Not only that, they're worried about the destruction of those voters' assets. It's not a matter of them losing it in the sense that I lost money because I made a bad trade. That means Jim made a good trade, right? It's a zero-sum game in some instances. This is not a zero-sum game. This is a 1-0 game, in that if you're doing these transactions exclusively through this sort of unregulated, no legal system, no recourse, no safety net version of crypto, there's literally nothing to do. You go to that cell tower in Afghanistan and you move that $1 million and you type in the wallet address wrong and you're just done, right? Or you have that $1 million and you get your thumb blown off and that's the only thing that you had as a biometric to open your phone, and no, I'm sorry, you don't have the reserve password. You just lost access to literally everything you own in that ecosystem with no recourse, no way to get any of it back, no way to sue for it. That is a real issue, right? That is a rule of law issue. And that's where this runs into, I think we keep running into this issue in crypto. We've advanced the technology far beyond our legal system's capacity to deal with it. And so we're trying to create a legal system to deal with it, and we're mostly failing miserably.
Okay.
I would agree with you that is the biggest issue, and that is the scariest issue about this whole space, is that that's why it's so popular with libertarians. There is a personal responsibility. I have a MetaMask wallet. I have a ledger as well too. These are cold storage devices. I have my secret password in secret places, but if I lose it, this stuff's gone. And there is no 800 customer service number to call. And that is unsettling for a lot of people in a lot of ways. You could use a regulated exchange like a Coinbase to custody for you, but then you're reliant on them doing it. Because
there's got to be a trusted third party somewhere in the mix, right? And I think there's this idea that this libertarian dream where everything is zero proof, everything is permissionless. The problem is most of the world doesn't want to live that way all the time. We do for the occasional thing. Don't really want everybody knowing what books I buy and things like that. But when it comes to buying a house, I really want them to be sure it's me when somebody signs my deed. Like, I don't want there to be a chance somebody got my wallet from me and didn't present that authentication. And we're all pretty used to dealing with those levels of authentication, right? You swipe a card for $10. Nobody even asks for your PIN code anymore. You buy a house, you have to show ID. Like, we're pretty used to that variation, but we've got no good tech stack for it.
The other thing to keep in mind too is what's pushing back on this is the natural pushback to the whole permissioning cancel culture thing, because yes, we want somebody in there in case there's a mistake or in case there's a problem, but then once they're in there, they can also make decisions on certain transactions will be allowed, other transactions won't be allowed, and then maybe a different political ideology will come in and we'll start changing those.
And then it's China.
This is part of the push. Yeah, and then it's China. This is the pushback against it, and this is why this permissionless culture is really pushed. This permissionless idea is pushed in this culture. I don't want to be censored. I don't want to need permission to do certain things. I could do it out of my own free will.
Okay. So in the interest of time, we've got about 10 minutes left. Thank you both for a really interesting conversation on those three areas. We've got some great questions that have come in, and quite a few questions from GIC members. So let's try to get through a few of these. First question is, doesn't CBDC use reduce the benefit of seigniorage, the ability to issue your own debt? Jim, you want to take that one?
It can. It depends. Again, I guess we'll have to go all the way back to the beginning and say there are lots of different ways that you can do a CBDC. In some of those instances, it can. In other those instances, as Dave said, if we're just going to take the ACH and just slap the word CBDC on it and go, there you go, there's a new CBDC, it really won't. So it really comes down to, like I said, with the Fed's paper, I think their struggle is they understand it, and they understand the issues, and there's 18 different ways they can go, and they've got 19 different ideas on how to do it. And that's why they can't get that paper out the door, because it is such a difficult issue to deal with, because they don't want to disintermediate any aspect of the current system, or at least whether it's deposit taking by banks or seniorage, or whether it's payment transfer or payment rails, or all of the above. They don't want to wind up disrupting a lot of those things in ways that they think that could impact financial stability. That's what makes this so hard, which is why the question is, what problem are you trying to solve with the CBDC?
Well, I'd go all the way to the other extent and say, actually, a central bank digital currency makes it terrifyingly easy for the government to borrow all the money it wants, because just look at all the brouhaha about $600 caps on reporting requirements at banks. Like, imagine a world now where every one of those dollars that you thought you owned was actually just a ledger deposit somewhere at a CBDC. And they just decide, hey, anybody who has a balance over $10,000, we're issuing you a note and we're taking that cash, right? That becomes child's play with an authoritarian version of the CBDC. So you don't even have to issue notes anymore. You just decide that all of the cash on the books is yours, and you're just going to issue scrip against it. Like, there's nothing stopping you if you're in a sort of a Xi regime.
So in this same vein, one of our members asked the question and says, actually, what the CBDC assessment by the central banks is very clear. It's that desperate need to retain the ability to control the money supply and collect taxes. So he's asking, could you just talk about that need for the central banks and how that conflicts with the DeFi, what's happening in the DeFi space? So
it's the same reason that the government doesn't print a lot of $10,000 bills, right? They want to control the flow of money. And the way they do that is by focusing on the big piles first and the little piles a lot less. So they don't track dollars, but they ostensibly track $10,000 transactions. I don't see this as really being fundamentally any different here. If anything, and I put well in air quotes, if from the perspective of a central banker, a well-run central bank digital currency would enable all of these things, from issuing debt to collecting taxes to locking people out of the ecosystem entirely if they were considered bad actors. I understand why people are concerned about it. I don't have any desire for all of my wealth to be on a CBDC blockchain somewhere. I don't think anybody else does either. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen and we shouldn't be ready for it.
So Jim, this one's for you. One of our board members talks about the Boston Fed and MIT are doing some research together on CBDC space. And from the paper, he's just highlighting that its purpose is determine if the CBDC can meet the design requirements of the US central banks. So that's just a statement. The question is, will banking institutions and or central banks go the way of the post office? Will there be crypto FedEx, a crypto UPS, a crypto Amazon? And he wraps up the question with, will Amazon accept crypto as a payment for goods and services?
So to take those, I think in order, the Boston MIT paper is more of a technical paper that's going to talk about the technology of whether or not they should use a decentralized blockchain or use a centralized system, the throughput, the transactions per second, and a lot of those type of subjects. The Fed paper I was referring to is more about the policy. What problem are we trying to solve? How are we going to go about doing it? What does it mean for the banking system? And then, the MIT paper will have the more of a technical aspect of how it could be done. So that's the way that we would start to look at those. Now, as far as your question goes, if we were to get, the second half of your question was, do we get
well, the banks go the way of the post office, and then the third part,
they can. If the Federal Reserve or the CBDC wants to get into competition in deposit taking with banks, open up your wallet with the Fed, deposit your money with the Fed. And while you're at it, you can also have your direct deposit paycheck put into your electronic wallet with the Fed. It's the safest place in the world to have your money, would be directly with the Federal Reserve and not with a bank. If they were to go that route, they could compete with the banks. And I think the banks would be at a very big disadvantage. And I think the banks are correct to scream that the Federal Reserve is the umpire. It can't also be the batter at the same time, because you can't both regulate me and also get a chance to go up to the plate and bat at the same time. That's essentially what they would be doing with the CBDC. And as Dave pointed out, I think if they were to go that route, they would pretty much need legislation from Congress in order to go down that route. They just can't wave a wand and say, we're just going to get into the business of disrupting the banks as well. And the third part
they're going to lean on the banks to do all the KYC for them, right? So it's hard for me to imagine a world in which the end state here is not one that panders to the needs of the commercial and retail banking environment, offloads all the KYC requirements onto the retail banking segment. The Fed's involvement here basically just becomes, the asynchronous keeper of records, which frankly is sort of how the ACH system works now, which is sort of my point about just slapping a coat of paint on ACH and saying you did it right, because it's fundamentally going to do the same thing. Bank to bank transfers are going to be the primary settlement. Bank to Fed settlement will be secondary. Like it basically just sort of looks like traditional banking right now. You've just made the rails more intelligent.
So that's what gets to my fear with the CBDC, and why I've often said when people ask me about one, it either A, we won't get one because they can't come to a conclusion as to what they're going to do, or B, they're going to put so many restrictions and rules and so narrowly to focus it. If Dave's right, and I think he very well might be, you're going to slap a bunch of paint on the ACA and call it a CBDC. So what? You've accomplished nothing. What problem have you fixed with this thing? Me as an end user, it's not going to change anything for me. I still got to go to Citibank, which is my bank, and I still have to have a demand deposit account with them. And things are going to look pretty much like they have now, and not a whole lot's going to change. And so what have you really accomplished by going through all this with the CBDC? Now, if you want to accomplish something, you probably have to risk getting into the banking system and competing directly with them. And I agree with Dave. They don't want to do that.
One of the other, or letting go. You have to take more control from the banks, which they will be reluctant to do because banks will scream and yell, and they're all bankers or politicians depending on the day of the week, right? So the revolving door keeps that from happening. Or they have to actually let go of control and say, hey, we're willing to allow some of the KYC and AML stuff to get a little squirrely in the guise of really making innovation happen in the United States and being the country that wins this battle, right? Because that's going to happen whether we play or not.
Let me take that last point for this, because this next question goes right to that. Is all of this technology leading the DeFi jungle into more illegal transactions, more tax avoidance, more nefarious activities?
Let me jump in. I was just going to say, as far as the last conversation we had, and this is why a CBDC is so damn difficult to come up with, and why they're struggling. These are big issues. As far as the the DeFi jungle, illegal activities, and tax avoidance, let me push back a little bit on that, and let me point out a couple of truisms. Most of the academic studies I've seen done on KYC, know your customer, and AML, anti-money laundering rules, have shown that they are largely ineffective, that they maybe capture 1% of all of the illegal transactions that go on, and the cost that they bear on the system to get that 1% is wholly out of proportion with what they're getting as well, too. So in other words, the current level of KYC AML rules is a bad deal. We pay way too much to get way too little from it as well, too. All you got to do is say HSBC. I just said it. There you go. As far as, looking at, problems with AML, KYC, and illegal transactions. Now, on the other side of the equation, the estimates are you've got 1.7 billion people unbanked. One of the biggest drivers of inequality is the difference between having a bank account and being unbanked. Part of the reason that those people, or maybe the main reason that those people are unbanked, is the traditional system is too damn slow and too damn expensive. As I've joked around with people on Twitter, I've said, if you have enough money, and we all do on this conversation, you've got a bank account, you've meet minimums, you don't pay monthly statements, maybe you download Venmo or Zelle, I could send Dave $100 in 3 seconds. It doesn't cost me anything. But if I'm a migrant worker, and I want to send $200 back to my family in Mexico, and I walk into a bank or a Western Union office with two $100 bills and say, I want to send this to so-and-so in this town in Mexico, it's going to cost me $50, and it's going to cost me, a couple of weeks to do it. The estimates are that a lot of these unbanked people that need to transfer money either to family or to pay for things spend upwards of 15% of their income every year to meet their needs being unbanked. That means they work a month a year just to pay the payment rails that they use. That is a terrible cost that is bared on the world, and that needs to be fixed. The problem is the current system between correspondence and payment rails is so obtuse, so entrenched, and so bureaucratic. It is going to be very, very difficult to kind of streamline that entire system to make it where anybody can send somebody anything, even with KYCML, in a couple of seconds and a few pennies. So that's one of the pushes for the crypto space to come up with, is we're looking at all of the underprivileged, the underbanked, the non-banked, and we might be able to offer them an alternative. My Afghanistan example is one of them.
Thank you, Jim. Great answer to the question. We've got time for two more. Cryptocurrency, is its potential really more for the consumer retail side, or is it more for industrial and business?
I think the short answer is both, and that's a terrible, terrible answer. There are really strong applications on both sides, but they tend to be very different applications. So just raw Bitcoin ownership as a balance sheet asset, as something moving around between businesses, I actually think has already been enormously beneficial and enormously useful. And I think that will continue to be the case. I remember when I started my career in the 80s, we were shoveling, briefcases full of Krugerrands around South America to buy industrial equipment, because it was the only thing you had that was stable enough that you could get it out of the country and into the system in South America fast enough. Certain countries that shall remain nameless in the 80s. So it solved a lot of those bigger picture problems. And to Jim's point, the Afghanistan example, versions of the system also solve a lot of local problems too. They tend to be different, right? They tend to be different rails. They tend to be different systems, right? Paying for a cup of coffee with Bitcoin directly is a terrible, terrible use of the technology, as would be, trying to pay $10 million to somebody on ETH, right? You're using the wrong tool for the wrong job. So a lot of these tools are being developed. They're being developed so quickly, and the changes to the protocols are happening so fast that it's understandable that people have a hard time keeping up. I know I do too. Like if I haven't read my crypto reading in a week, I assume everything I know is wrong.
Let me underscore that too. I try to dedicate a couple of hours a day. I'm up to a couple hours a day trying to keep up with this space. And that might not be enough. It changes. NFTs didn't exist, or they weren't even a thing in the beginning of the year. They technically existed as well too. DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, weren't even thought of a whole lot 90 days ago. And now all of a sudden they're becoming the next big thing as well too. That's how fast this space changes. So it is a very, very, it's going to be hard for regulators, because the minute that they settle on what we're going to regulate, we're going to be 4 versions past that by the time the regulations are put into place.
Which is why I'm convinced it's all going to be bad. Like the regulation's not going to be good. It can't be.
Right. It just, the space moves week by week. It's changing week by week.
Okay, so final question, and I'd like to get both of you to respond to this one, please. Jim, we'll start with you. Looking into the future, how might blockchain impact the social contract?
There is I just mentioned it, a decentralized autonomous organization. And that's basically run off of the blockchain as well too. I'm going to try and keep this at a high level, not get too much in the weeds. The current corporation that we use was developed in the Renaissance. It got its popularity, and the current business structure came out of World War II with all of the generals. We call them all vice presidents, from assistant vice president to senior executive vice president. And there's an argument that's being made that structure was well put, and even the current fractional banking system was developed really for the Industrial Revolution. And it served all of those purposes well. But now as we move into the information age, those types of structures don't work very well. And that a decentralized autonomous organization as the new way of working might be the next thing that's coming down the pike, and it might be the next big thing. Now, what is it? What it is basically is it's an organization that's owned by nobody, and I'm trying to keep this high level, or it's owned by all the token holders. You can come into the organization and make a proposal that I will do X, Y, and Z for the organization. It could be anything from HR compliance help to programming the protocol or whatever. And if enough people in the organization agree, they'll pay you to do it. You could then go to another DAO and keep doing the same thing over and over. So it's a version of gig work that we're moving towards. You've seen that the economy, especially in the younger generation, is moving towards this whole gig work thing. This is a way to formalize it. So the question is, where could we wind up being, 10, 20 years down the road because of this technology? We could take ways that we organize ourselves. We organize ourselves around a corporation, and we could change that to a DAO. A DAO is not a limited liability corporation. I know it gets mixed up with that. It's a little bit more than that. But this is just one way that we could be looking well beyond these currencies and that on ways that we seem to organize ourselves. The last thought for you on this, where you're seeing this application happening the most. I know I'm going to assume I have an idea about the demographic that I'm talking to. It's my demographic as well, too. I am one of the youngest baby boomers out there. Dave's a Gen Xer as well. And the biggest cultural push in the world today is gaming. Gaming creates more revenues than all of professional sports worldwide, including the EPL and the NFL, all movies, all television, and all movie radio combined. There's 2 billion people that spend at least an hour a day gaming. And all of the people that are driving this whole crypto space are coming out of games as well too. Do not discount that gaming is a cultural force that is just pushing everything. They're structuring themselves as DAOs and have been structuring themselves as DAOs for the last couple of years in the way that the games are being played, are being worked on as well too, and they do them in remote works in remote areas. So if you've got a younger son or daughter, or grandson or granddaughter that plays games, they probably sit in their room all day long. But if you actually look at what they're doing with those games, there's incentives that they've been put to. They're doing tasks to earn rewards. They're mentoring younger kids sometimes in those games. They're being mentored by older kids. And all of this is happening while they sit in their room doing these games. And a lot of people have looked at that structure, the DAO structure that they use, and say, that could be the way of the future corporation is run because of the way it is. It's more set up for an information age as opposed to an industrial revolution age like we currently have with a lot of our structures.
Can I give you the counter on the exact same point? Everything you said is true. It also paints a picture of a society that is a capitalist hellscape that I want nothing to do with. I honestly believe that, because all you do in that environment is say, nothing matters, no rule of law, no protections for any individual, nothing. The only thing that speaks is money. And if you have enough money to buy the DAO tokens, you run the world for that moment that you own those tokens. The stuff that's being done in the game space around this, particularly by GIC, I think is problematic and likely illegal in the way that it is basically enslaving an entire generation of children at the behest of capitalists, all of whom are anonymous. Like there are significant societal problems that exist in a world where there is 100% anonymity and the only thing that matters is who has money for the moment. And that's what most of these systems devolve to, which is why I think it's really important to pay attention to the policy issues.
Right. And I would disagree with some of that about that. And you're right about Axie. Axie Infinity is a big decentralized game, which estimated now that there's something nearly 500,000 people in the Philippines are getting paid off of that game. And it's actually becoming something that you could measure at the GDP level in the Philippines, that it's become that important. But it seems to be, at least for the younger generation, the whole gig work generation, you know, the Uber drivers, the Door Dashers,
But none
the
of
Dow
them want to
players.
be in that, though. That's the thing.
I disagree. I think that's the way that they like it. They like this kind of flexibility that they
That's
can
not
take on
how
as
that
many.
group polls. That group wants to buy houses, want full-time jobs, and they want retirement plans. If you actually look at polls of 22-year-olds, they do not want to be in the gig economy. They
No,
really
I've
don't.
seen polls that say the other way. But nevertheless, let me go back to the default. The current structures we have were built for the Industrial Revolution, and they're bumping up against the information revolution. And that, whether it's the banking system, whether it's the corporation, or how we organize ourselves as well too. And there is a rub there, and that rub is going to have to get worked out. We're probably going to have to find a new type of way to organize ourselves around an information age. Now, maybe the current Dow is a little bit too Wild West libertarian, and we pull it back some. But I also don't think that what people want is they want to go to big corporation and start working their way up the various levels of vice president. That era, that's our era, I think has gone. But I don't know what the new era is going to be. But this Dow structure is definitely something that has been getting a lot of interest by people.
All right, gentlemen, conversation to be continued. Jim and Dave, thank you very much for a terrific discussion and for spending time with the GIC community. We hope both of you will be able to join us again on a program very soon. So thank you both.
Thank you.
So audience, our next executive briefing will be November 4th with a program discussing the increasingly complex relationship between China and the United States. Our featured guest will be Dr. Jonathan Ward of Atlas Organization and Scott Lincecum of the Cato Institute. Again, that will be Thursday, November 4th, 4 p.m. Eastern, and registration is now open at the GIC website. As a reminder, to hear a replay of today's executive briefing or to find video replays, learn about GIC membership, or to register for our next event, please go to our website. That's www.interdependence.org. As we conclude, please take 30 seconds to respond to the audience survey. Your feedback is very important to us. We appreciate you letting us know how we can improve our programming. Thank you very much for your attention, and good afternoon.